yes, I am going to watch Barbie later. Not Barbenheimer. I wish it was Barbenheimer, but it's just gonna be Barbie. I'm gonna set my little Truly and her wine glass aside, and I'm gonna begin with my July reading wrap-up. Ooh, also look at my background. That's my mood board. That's a whole separate thing, but like, I have a mood board now. First time ever. And today's video is going to be specifically my July reading wrap-up. First up, we have A Door Behind a Door by Yelena Moskovich, which details sort of the story of this girl, Olga, whose family had moved to the US from Russia, and it takes a look at not only her family, but some figures from her past. I think it is very, I think it described it as like inception-y. It really is, you know, these stories coming in and out, and you see how like trauma is affected, and one, you know, pivotal event you think is just one, then you realize, oh, actually like 6 steps before this other thing happened, and these characters are all interwoven and interlaced. It's written in a very unique style. In my like Slavic summer episode 2, I described it as being kind of halfway between poetry and prose, and I still think that's very true. It's very kind of confusing, but not so confusing that you don't understand the actual narrative that is going forward. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a quick read. It's not like spectacular, groundbreaking, everyone must read this, but if the general themes of like community trauma and like cycles of trauma repeating and queerness and, you know, the sense of being an immigrant and the sense of like uneasiness that comes with that, and the lack of resources and the lack of security that comes with that, if those things are interesting to you, I think this would be a good book to pick up. But after that, I read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This was definitely a pick because of Books and Bow, her video, where she talked about T. Kingfisher, and it was really great. My roommate and I, we read it whilst driving to and fro the Connecticut shoreline, and it was such a great book too, because it has like these horror elements, these mystery elements. It was something where like we were pausing and being like, what do you think is gonna happen next? So definitely great road trip book. I also loved the kind of gender element. There's a character who like exists outside the gender binary, and I like the way that was incorporated and included, and it you know, it made for a part of the story, and it was interwoven very well, and it wasn't kind of like a throwaway thing. It was like something that was discussed and in depth, and still made for like but wasn't necessarily like this the like main focus of the story. It was kind of like this very important side part, and I believe that this might be a series, which would be really cool. So that way, like, this is the defining first book, and then in the later chapters or later iterations of the series, you know, you don't have to like kind of go back in, you already have that background information. But it was a really good book, and I just love creepy horror stuff that has some kind of investigatory element to it, where you're trying to figure out what's happening, and I feel like those are the most exciting when it has that in it as well. And also I'm very glad that my roommate was there, because I would not have realized until later that this was like a retelling of an Edgar Allan Poe, The House of Usher story. After that, I listened on audiobook to The Greatest Story Ever Sold, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina by Frank Rich. I will say I did not like the narrator of this audiobook, which made it very hard to generally enjoy the book itself. I also felt like at some point it just became like listing all of these events and being like, and here's how they lied, and here's how they lied. And I just think that in a post-Trump America, politician lied is just so, oh, really? They did that again? Like, it's nothing to me. So I feel like, I think it would have been more interesting to see maybe like a larger not methodology, but like more kind of background information, or more of an explanation of like, oh, this is how truth is used, and this is how like perceptions got more involved or something. Like, I just felt like it was very much like, guys, did you know that George W. Bush lied about stuff, and people lied for him, and there were liars? And that's like, oh, our former president is being indicted. Like, people lie? What? You know? To me, it's like that is just not a crazy story anymore. And I think too, especially with the way that like we interact with social media, we can see how lies spread and grow, and conspiracy theories, like not even just like, I mean, obviously Trump is very involved in this, but like even just like the whole QAnon, like we see how corrupted truth is now much more. So I just think like this book might have been very great to read when it was first written, but now it's one of those books that we all, not only do we know the story, like we know the worst conclusions that are made from it. So what I was saying, I distracted myself. But basically, like this book, it's just, we not only know this information, like we not only know like the lies that were told, we also know then the like extenuation, the continuation of that. So we know what happens after this, and I think in that way, yeah, it was probably great to read at some point, but at this point in my personal feeling, like, I don't think you have to read this book. Not that anyone has to read a book ever, but like, you can skip this one. After that, I read The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich, and this is a book that is filled with interviews from different women who served in World War II, and you get to see different people. In my last video, I called them sapper miners, but I think they're miner sappers. But yeah, basically you're interviewing people, you're not interviewing. Alexievich was interviewing people and like, you know, talking about like what their experiences were, figuring out how they served. So they could have been like a pilot or a medic or a surgeon or a miner sapper. Or partisan or something along those lines, or there were some who like served in the laundry unit, and it was a really dark read, but very good. And I think that if you would like to learn more about World War II, but you want this like very emotional, like really personal read, I would say more than just emotional, like very personal, and it's not like the overall arching statements. It's the mostly focusing on those narratives and the memories and the experiences of people, especially like young people and especially women. I think this is a really great book for you to read. It is very, very hard though. I think it's impossible for a book like that to not be a difficult read. Yeah, and it's translated by Richard Peyvard and Larissa Valachonsky. So I recommend that one. That one was hard, but I did enjoy it. I'm very glad that I read it. After that, I finally finished Unbowed by Wangari Maathai, who is a big like environmentalist in Kenya, and it was just a fascinating memoir of hers, and it took a look at her life from her like young childhood and the relationship she had with the Kenyan nature then, and then it takes a look at her education, you know, how like she was not raised, but like she was educated in like Catholic schools and the effect that that had, and she talked about the colonialization and everything, and then also talked about going to the US and her experiences in the US and coming back. And I think it's really fascinating that you have this woman who like she just wanted to be like a researcher or a professor. She just wanted to be like a politician's wife and still do her own thing. She just wanted to like plant trees, and just by being a woman who is at like the forefront and the cutting edge of something, she was constantly seen as like this like distracting element. She was constantly like getting arrested or getting in trouble, and she's like, the radical thing that she wanted to do is like advocate for women's rights and corruption and like plant her trees. Like at the end of the day, if you just let this lady plant her trees, you know, like everything would have been fine. But just because of the way that like corrupt governments see anyone with like power and influence, they have to take them down. And of course, I definitely think that like Maathai would have fought for justice and democracy no matter what. I'm not saying that like, oh, she wouldn't have fought if like for these things if they had let her just like plant her trees, but I just think it's really fascinating to see like to be in that situation, just like I'm just trying to do this very simple thing, and yet they refused to let me do that. Like obviously she was doing a lot more than that, but still You get what I mean. It was a really good read, and I think that if you would like to read a memoir, and a memoir about an African woman who kind of was, especially in like the 20th century and all the social changes that we saw, like all of the work that she did, I think this is a really cool story that you can check out. In July was The Undocumented Americans by Karla, Cornejo, Villavicencio. And this is a short book, and it is looking at the lives of undocumented Americans, and it focuses the stories on different places. So like chapter 1 is Staten Island, chapter 2 Ground Zero, chapter 3 Miami, Flint, Cleveland, and New Haven. Personal like side note, my favorite was Miami for sure. But it takes a look at all like different challenges that undocumented Americans have. It kind of goes into the background of them. But I think a lot of this book is trying to provide and instill humanity into stories about undocumented Americans. A lot of what I felt is just kind of, you know, that whole thing with like the wealth gap, right? Like people who come from families that like are low income, when they get money, they then have to turn around and like still support their family because their family doesn't have resources, and you're not gonna like let your family starve or let them like not have access to healthcare. Like you're going to support them. And so you constantly see the way that for Villavicencio, this not just like, oh, like it's not just like her family, it's like her community, right? She feels a sense of like deep responsibility to her community. And I liked how she talked about, you know, like compared to other journalists who like come in and they're so removed, like she's like giving people money and helping them out. And for her, like she's not writing a story about like a subject. She's writing a story about her community and her life and her experiences. And I think it's something that like a lot of Americans should read and should like actively pay attention to and think about.
I think I was not very clear here. What I meant to say was, when you're reading stories and headlines, oftentimes I think we relegate stories about undocumented immigrants to stories that like feature that. But I think this book reminded me as an American to also pay attention, just because undocumented like Americans were not at the highlight, they're still there, right? You know, like Superstorm Sandy, how were the undocumented Americans impacted by that? And especially in the aftermath where their labor gets exploited. Like all of these places where it's like an already vulnerable population who doesn't have access to like healthcare and resources and is already vulnerable and like targeted, you know, making sure that you're attentive and aware and not sort of forgetting about that group and only relegating them to stories about, you know, or not stories about, but stories that like exactly feature and focus on undocumented Americans from like the perspective of like deportation or the perspective of like, you know, crossing a border or something along those lines. Like remembering that these people exist across America at different sections, and like if something's occurring, you should try to see how it's affecting these people, because these people will often face like the biggest risks and the least resources. So yeah, just wanted to add that in there.
Thinking about like who these people are and like their actual individual stories. There's something that she was doing in the beginning where she was like essentially taking the story of a person, but then building a narrative around them to kind of humanize them. And I wish she'd kind of continue to do that. I think it's like a powerful way to end your chapter of like, I've just explained to you, you know, these circumstances and the challenges that these people face, and now let me give you this like deeply emotional and personal story to like conclude. Like how in nonfiction works, they oftentimes will like have a chapter and like they give all the data and then they have like a wrapping up section, or sometimes they'll do the opposite where they like explain something to you in the end they'll give you the data. I think it would have been cool to have like, let me tell you the stories in my interviews and all the like the information I know, and then let me give you this like spotlight of a character that I've mostly like created to provide and instill that empathy within you as like a last bit. But yeah, it was a really there are definitely things that I will say, like sometimes I feel like she had this level of honesty that I don't know, like she kind of would judge characters. No, they're people, obviously, I don't know, like they're people, but like she would judge people and she would say kind of what her thought, and I'm like, well, you're assuming something about that person. And like, if you have a reason to assume that about them, you should include that, but she kind of wouldn't. She would just sort of say like, oh, like, for example, there's this one gentleman and he's staying at a church as like a safe haven to avoid being deported. And she talks about these other people who are coming in and out, and she kind of says something like judgmental, and I'm like, is this something that gentleman felt and you're picking up on his feelings and you're trying to instill in us how he felt, or is it just how you felt? And I wish I kind of knew that, because I don't know, at some point I was like, well dang, like maybe they were just trying to be nice too. Or like she made a comment about certain people's, like, oh, this felt very performative to me. And it's like, well, if you're not religious, a lot of religious stuff can feel very performative, but if you are religious, that isn't a performance, that's like a genuine experience, you know? So I didn't know how to like take that stuff, but that's kind of like small things that slightly annoy me about the book, but at the end of the day, very good book, and you should definitely pick it out. It had been on my list. It had been on my list for like such a long time, so I'm very glad I read it, and I read it as part of my like DE&I book club. So those were all of my reads for July. I can't believe it's already August. That's so crazy. And currently I am reading The Bonfire by Gheorghe Dragaman, which is amazing. I'm having a great time reading this. Anyway, I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.